So, excuse me. Hi again, everybody. My name is Justin Richer, and I am here to talk about the Grant Negotiation and Authorization Protocol, also known as GNAP. People ask me a lot how you're supposed to pronounce the name of this protocol. I pronounce it GNAP. I've heard NAP. I've heard GNAP. I've heard lots of other strange permutations. Ultimately, I kind of don't care. But I say GNAP. Mostly because of the Smurfs. And if you're not familiar with the Purple Fly episode of the Smurfs, go look it up. It's kind of great. All right. I want to start off by saying that, well, first off, thanks to Daniel and Torsten for inviting me to come give this presentation on GNAP and kind of where we are right now with it. Because even though this is an OAuth security workshop, GNAP is not OAuth 2. It's not an extension of OAuth 2. It's not a profile. It's not an application of OAuth 2. It is a new protocol. It is also, however, not OAuth 3. In spite of this this logo that I spent way too much time putting together a couple of years ago. OAuth 3 doesn't exist. The OAuth working group's not working on it. But GNAP is a protocol that takes a lot of things from the OAuth world and applies them in some different ways. So in the OAuth world, as we just saw, even in the last presentation, which, yes, I also want to second that last comment. Great job getting through what Depop is and how it works so quickly, Brian. I know that's hard to do. But we're seeing a whole bunch of stuff in OAuth 2 where we've got all of these different profiles and extensions and adaptations that have to work within OAuth 2's limitations. Some of those limitations come with comments like Mike made in the last session of, we have this parameter, it could probably be used for this, but that would break things, so we don't want to necessarily use for that. Those are considerations you have to make when adding on to OAuth 2. And there's some new work that barely even really looks like OAuth anymore. Stuff like pushed authorization requests and even CIBA, I would argue, are doing things in a very, very kind of different way, but they're still compatible with OAuth. They still work within the OAuth framework, but you're really doing ultimately a very different kind of protocol with these new systems. And we especially see that in some of the vertically integrated spaces, like a lot of the open banking systems that have their own profiles for all of the different moving parts and pieces within OAuth. So the thing, though, is that OAuth, all of that actually makes sense. All of that work makes sense because OAuth isn't going anywhere. It's been around for a decade and it's solved problems in absolutely brilliant ways and it will continue to do so. But it does have its limitations. There are some things that I know that a lot of us who worked on the original OAuth spec wish we would have made different decisions back in the day. Like JSON encoding is the big one that I keep kind of coming back to for the token endpoint request, even though I argued against it at the time. But that was wrong, and we're seeing a lot of limits in the OAuth spec and implementations of the spec because of this legacy. So the goal here is to apply these lessons learned, to take the new stuff that people have been building, especially over the last couple of years, and ask ourselves the question, if we were building a system that did all of this today, what would it look like? With that comes the question, why not just build on top of OAuth 2? Well, like I said, a lot of these extensions are, but the assumptions that are in OAuth they limit what we can do. For example, with rich authorization requests, we had to take JSON objects and encode them in form parameters in order to get them into all of the right places that they need to be. OAuth 2 makes use of, if you're using authorization code, you're starting everything in the front channel, so you're losing a lot of security because you're going through an intermediary as soon as you start. There's this underrunning assumption that it's all about a single user with an account at an AS, which is good for lots of use cases, but not all of them. So this family of protocols is incredibly flexible, but that's also a big limitation, as I think we all know. in compatibility and interoperability with all the different moving parts of OAuth, especially when you start bolting together all of the different extensions and things. Now, in the spirit of collaboration and everything else, and sort of moving things forward, a lot of what I'm going to talk about today in GNAP has been backported to OAuth, or is in the process of being backported, RAR and PAR being the two biggest ones. And but there's a bunch of other stuff that's happening. We were just talking about Depop. There's interaction pattern stuff that's happening with SIOP v2 that I think is kind of interesting, and it's making us question, like, we as a community are questioning, what is OAuth really all about? What can it do? How is it limited in terms of what do we call this? What can we do to this and still call it OAuth? With GNAP, we are taking even a step further from that and saying, what can we build and not have it try to be compatible with OAuth 2? So the design goals in GNAP are to try to keep things simple where possible, especially for clients, borrowing the OpenID Connect mantra of keep the simple things simple, the complex things possible. To also keep things consistent where possible. There was a lot of stuff that I know I found working in the OAuth space, where you had things that were one way in a request and one way in a response, or one way at the token endpoint and one way at the authorization endpoint. Let's try to keep things as parallel as we can. Combine similar things where it makes sense to do so. Make sure it works with all these current technologies and current deployment patterns. And another big design tenet is don't rely on the front channel for security as much as OAuth does. Use the front channel where it makes sense to. And that brings us to the core design pillars behind GNAP that I want to talk about today. It's a protocol for negotiating access that contains methods for interacting with people and ways of validating the client software. And it has its own model of what client software is. It has methods for binding keys to message requests, both with and without tokens. And it's got a new data model for what's being requested. I'm going to go through each of these different pillars, and there's a lot of material and a lot of information. I'm keeping an eye on the chat and the little speaker head gallery here for hands. So if you have a question as we're going on, feel free to try to jump in. I may, since we have a lot of material, I may tell you to hold on and we'll get back to that. So just keep that in mind. But with that, the current draft is 08 in the IETF. You can see the editor's draft on GitHub as we're actively working on it. The txauth at ietf.org is the mailing list for the GNAP working group. This is not in the OAuth working group. It is its own separate working group, although most of us are in both working groups. Then we have the companion resource servers draft, which hasn't seen as much attention yet. So that's only at draft 1. You can also see that in GitHub as well. I've also put together a playground that you can play around with what the different message requests and response types look like in different sort of combinations. If you go to oauth.xyz, if you guys remember my initial proposal for this work a couple of years ago, started on this website. I have now converted that to a site that talks about GNAP and really talks about sort of my own implementations of GNAP. All right, so first big pillar is that this is a protocol all about negotiating access. So it's a conversation between a piece of software and another piece of software to try and get stuff. Fundamentally, just like OAuth, it's a delegation protocol, but what's being delegated is the subject of this conversation. So you've got a client instance that knows what it wants and asks for that. And it also, at the same time, is allowed to present anything that it knows that can help with that decision. And the authorization server responds based on that request. If the client has presented enough information, enough bits and pieces to fulfill the policies for what it wants, it can get it. If somebody needs to get involved, you can do that over time. And that's a really important thing about this conversation. It's not a single request. It is an iterative process, really. The client goes and says, this is what I have, and the server can come back with, okay, yes, but I need this other thing first before I will give that to you. And it gives the client a chance to kind of keep going and doing that. All of this starts with the intent registration pattern, which is the basis of the push authorization request, which is the client goes and talks to the authorization server first in the back channel before anything else kicks off. And that message has a bunch of different parts to it. It's the stuff the client wants to access, the ways that the client knows how to interact with the user that's sitting there, information about the client software itself, information about the user that the client wants, and information about the user that the client has. Because sometimes we know in some deployments like CIBA, the client actually knows who the user is in the auth, before the auth server does. We want to be able to present that and push that information. And all of this is wrapped with cryptographic protection. So an example, simple request, and I'm not going to go into great detail. There's a lot of requests in the slide deck, and I also recommend checking out the OAuth.xyz website to play around with some of these. This particular request from a client, as you can see, it's a JSON object. We have a request for an access token, which says that we want an access token to allow us to do this thing. I want to access an API that has these two types of access, dolphin-metadata and another thing. You notice that these look a lot like OAuth scopes. More on that a little bit later. The client can also identify itself here using a client instance identifier. And the client here is also saying that if I need to interact, if you need me to interact with the user, here are the ways that I can start it. I can redirect them to a URI, or I can launch them. I can launch an application. And when that interaction is finished, here's how to get back to me. You can redirect back to this URL, and there's a nonce that gets bundled up and protected in all of this. Right? If my API is more complex, then I'm still asking for it in the same space. I'm asking for an access token that will give me foo and bar and dolphin metadata and that whole big object in the middle all in one token. And we'll get more into what that data model looks like later in the presentation. If I have a client that hasn't been pre-registered, that there is no identifier that the authorization server knows me ahead of time, then the client can present its keying information, its display information, all dynamically as part of that initial request. So there was a question in the HTTP signatures for OAuth section earlier today, and the question about how do I, could I present a key as part of that request, as part of the HTTP signature thing? In the OAuth world, just like Depop has done, we need to come up with a way to do that. Based on the model that Depop has presented, GNAP allows you to do this right from the start. So the client presents its keys and all of its other information here in order to actually get the thing that it wants. And sorry, something in chat. Multiple access objects in a single request. Yes, you can do that. And I've got an example for that later in the presentation. So the response from the server is where you get back any access tokens, any next steps for interacting with the user, any information about the current user, like OpenID Connect has shown us to be able to do, and the ability to continue that request, to continue that conversation if necessary. So typically what this looks like is that if you have, if you need to interact with the user, then right here, what we're saying is you can start the interaction by redirecting them to this URL. And when you finish, we've got this nonce, and there's this whole hash calculation I'm not going to get into for security purposes, or the hash calculation is for security purposes. But when you want to continue the request, that's what this block is for. You're given an access token and a URI to use that access token at in order to continue the GNAP response. Because GNAP is ultimately an API. It's an API that the client calls one endpoint, and then they're given everything they need to get to the next part of the process from that initial request. At the point where you're getting back an access token and information about the user, this is what that looks like. These are all GNAP responses. So this is a single access token. It's got a value, and it's got it's telling the client this hint that, yeah, I'm giving you access to these things that you asked for. But this is also, I will point out here that this is not a bearer token. This is bound to the client's key. Again, more on that a little bit later. You're also getting information about the user themselves. So OpenID Connect showed us the value in passing user information and access tokens along simultaneously. In GNAP, you can actually do these, you can request these things and respond with these things independently. So in this case, we are getting back a set of subject identifiers, in this case, a single opaque identifier that's, and then a flag for when that's been updated at the authorization server. And this is most of what most clients need in order to actually log somebody into a system. I would really like, I think it's possible. I definitely think that it's possible to layer in additional identity things like OpenID Connect has done on top of this base. But GNAP takes a very clear line of not defining what those are and leaving that to a proper, fully specified identity protocol. So this conversation means that you don't need pre-configuration for everything in the same way that OAuth 2 does. OAuth 2 needs to have a client ID everywhere, and dynamic registration was invented to solve that problem. You can do discovery and registration and extensions, and all of this stuff can happen ahead of time if you want to optimize it. But the protocol is built around this notion that by default, it can happen at runtime. It's sort of, you start with the dynamic complex case in the protocol first, and everything else is an optimization beyond that. All right. And then because everything starts the same way, we don't have different grant types anymore. And the systems can kind of change. The systems can kind of change things based on what they need. I see there's a question in the chat about JSON polymorphism. I'm not going to get into that unless we have a lot of time later. So GNAP protocol looks a lot like the OAuth protocol, and that's for very good reason. The difference here, the main difference is that because it's intent registration, you always start the same way at the authorization server, and the user gets involved only when they need to. So if you have a case where, say you've got an assertion that represents a user that you're giving to the client, they can give that to the authorization server, and sometimes that's good enough for an access token, but sometimes the user needs to get involved. In OAuth, that's two completely separate grants that have to start over at the very beginning. With different grant types. In GNAP, that's all just one ongoing conversation. And unless you think that that is sort of a strange straw man, that is the basis for a number of different open banking profiles that are out there in the wild today that people are actively using. All right. Already covered all of that. Right. So when the one of the things with this ongoing conversation is that these continuation requests can be used over time, over a longer period of time, such as updating with a patch method against that API in order to get different stuff. Right. All of these requests also always use a key bound access token, and it's the same key binding mechanism that's used when calling an RS. So this gets rid of one of the problems that we see in OAuth, where there's this strange disparity between the refresh token and the access token. And when we're putting parameters like depop keys on them, which do they apply to? How do I use them in both? In GNAP, we had the opportunity to say, you know what? Everything is an access token, and the authorization server is providing an API to interact with itself. So this is the continuation request. Like I said, it's processed with the token bound to the client's key. Just one example, there's a lot more in the spec and on the website. All right, so on to interaction. Just checking my time here. In OAuth 2, we've got grant types. We've got a ton of different grant types. It's one of the main extension points for doing something brand new in the OAuth world. And this is exactly why OAuth gets called a family of protocols and not a single protocol. One of the things that I realized, though, a number of years ago, long before I started working on this, is that the biggest differences in all of these are it's less about the nature of the client and more about the nature of how the client can get a person involved or whether they can get involved. And so if you want to just go get an access token, you're using assertions or client credentials. If you want to have a user involved, you have to start in a browser and then go get your token and all of this other stuff. So all of this gets folded into the GNAP interaction methods. And so in GNAP, you can say, I have a bunch of ways to start an interaction. I have a bunch of ways to finish an interaction. And sometimes maybe I can't interact at all. And I can tell you that by just saying there is no interaction section here. And that's valid. In the OAuth world, you have to choose between these different grant types right at the very start. And once you start one, you can't switch. And we see this working rather awkwardly, again, in the open banking world. There are at least 2 different open banking profiles where you start with a client credentials flow to get something, and then you go to the authorization code flow with Pixie in order to get the next piece of information to get the user involved, because the user can't be involved in client credentials, but you can't call the server first if you're not doing client credentials. In GNAP, like I said, that's an ongoing, figuring out all of that is part of that ongoing conversation. So when we make that first GNAP request to the authorization server, the client instance says, these are the things that I can do. I can start interaction using these 4 methods, and I can finish using this method. There's only one finish, and that's a security posture thing. Then the authorization server can basically look at that and say, okay, for the stuff that you're asking for, I don't want to do a user code. I don't know of any application URLs that I can launch for this. So I'm going to just respond to the redirect to an arbitrary URL and this extension that you told me about that I know how to do. And when we're done, yes, I will redirect back to you. So at no point is the AS able to say, here's this new thing that you, the client, didn't ask for that you now have to deal with. The AS is not allowed to do that because that would drive complexity way up for client applications to have to deal with unexpected things. And that design decision permeates throughout all of GNAP. Anytime that we've tried to push the complexity in the decision making to the authorization server and give the clients the flexibility to be able to say, like, here's all the stuff I could do, and I'm going to only expect back this subset that I care about. The AS, it's important to note here again that it responds not only with the things that it can support, so maybe the AS just doesn't do the user typable code like the device flow, but also what's appropriate for that request. Because the AS at this point knows what the client is asking for. And so the AS, let's say I'm trying to get somebody to log in and the AS knows what my client is, and it wouldn't be appropriate for my client application to ask somebody to log in using the device codes type of flow. So it's going to just say, no, you can't do that. If you ask for something else, maybe you can. That type of advanced policy decision-making is now up to the AS if it wants to exercise that type of decision. And if in the case where there is no overlap between those two sets, then, I mean, you can't interact. You have two things that are incompatible, and that is entirely possible. But unlike OAuth, where you can just maybe try to start a grant type and have that fail, or just have it never come back, you get back a message that that either says this is an error, I require interaction and you didn't give me one that I can use, or you get back something that says, okay, I can't interact, you can keep polling and maybe we can do something about that through an out of band mechanism. That's a possibility now. There's a clear sort of degradation of the state of the world when you have this mismatch between the two sides. So new interactions that so far I've talked about the kinds of things that OAuth already kind of does. But new types of interactions, I think, are really, really fascinating. And this is driving, I think, a lot of where I'm seeing people starting to really look into GNAP as a solution. So let's say, for example, somebody's got a digital wallet on their phone that's got a bunch of information about them, and you can use that agent to release attributes to allow access. And your resource server can transitively, through an authorization server, trust the user's presentation of those attributes. That's all well and good. So, but how do we turn that into an access token for the client? Well, in the user managed access, or UMA days, the mantra was bring your own authorization server, right? You just show up and you have an authorization server that this RS will just trust, and it will issue a token to the client, and that will get handed over to the resource server, who then validates it somehow. Now, the actual validation can be done using token introspection, except that this is a wallet on your phone, so the RS can't call it directly, so that's difficult. So maybe it's a token format, but the token format is opaque to the client, so that's a little tricky. Crossing this boundary in this on this backwards red line here turns out to be really, really, really difficult. This gets even weirder when we start to look at the solutions that declare that I am the authorization server. My wallet and everything is the client and is the authorization server. So since I need to access something, I'm just going to make up a new access token and hand it to you, and then you need to validate that, right? So we don't even have the abstraction layer here, but this kind of thing does get built and does get deployed, and that backtick arrow is really, really difficult. So bring your own AS in the UMA world is largely dead on arrival. It really never took off. That part of the UMA protocol never really took off. And we see a lot of resistance to resource server deployers wanting to or being willing to trust an arbitrary authorization server with all of their security parameters. And I would argue that's very reasonable. That's a healthy amount of skepticism. So if instead we look at the AS being a token factory. And this wording is important because a factory is something that takes raw material and produces something that is consumable, right? So in this model, the authorization server and resource server have their own relationship that's behind their own security lines. And it's the authorization server that takes in the claims from the wallet and any other type of interaction, and then issues the token based on that, right? This pattern is not new, because if you ever look at somebody who's deployed behind an API gateway, it's probably deployed like this. Your gateway is acting as sort of an internal AS that's doing sort of internal translation and sending the token back to the RS. And the token that the AS is getting from this distributed system is really more of an assertion message and not really a sort of normal access token. It's only kind of dressed up as one. And then the AS is processing all of the claims based on that, making its policy decisions, and then distilling that into a token that the RS can actually represent. In this case, though, we're saying that explicitly the AS is still issuing the token to the client. It's just that all of this new information coming from the wallet is talking to the AS itself. Now, the real value here is that this is another type of interaction, right? It allows the AS to say, like, I need to interact with you by talking to your wallet. I don't necessarily need you to come to a web page and sign in with an account. You probably don't even have an account. But if you've got a wallet I can talk to, I can get the information out of that fabric that I need to. I can do verifiable credential presentation and presentation request and say, like, look, I need to be able to call this and get this information back in. And that's what I can use to decide whether or not to give you the access token and ultimately what that access token is good for. And this is, like I said, this aligns with what we see in reality with OAuth 2 and UMA, even though people keep talking about bring your own AS. It's really bring your own set of information to the real AS that's doing the token work. This also allows us to start to address the issue of multi-user and multi-party delegation. Because if when my client goes and requests that access token, the AS says like, okay, fine, I know who you are, but you're not the person that can say okay to this. I can reach out to the actual resource owner and maybe get their okay. Or maybe the resource owner gave you something out of band that you can present to me at the AS, right? This is the, I can give you a key that you can access my house to feed my cat while I'm out of town, right? My AS can look for that type of thing and issue you an actual runtime usable token. And the RS is shielded from all of that complexity. It gets to do the job of just doing the API, just doing its services. All right. On to the notions of client software. So in OAuth, everything's got a client ID, but sometimes every instance gets a different ID. So dynamically registered clients, especially mobile applications, things like that. Then we get sometimes many instances have the same ID. So SPAs and non-dynamically registered mobile applications fit in this category, what we traditionally call the public client. Some clients last a really long time with a single user, like a mobile app. Some are completely ephemeral with a single user. Some have many different users and they last a long time, like a web application. And yet in OAuth, every single client has to have a client ID and we pretend that it means the same thing. This leads to lots of confusion and problems in the OAuth space. So like I mentioned before, this protocol is all about that conversation. And because of the nature of the conversation, we don't actually need any client identifiers. They're not required because client instances are identified by their cryptographic key material. Some of those are ephemeral, some are pre-registered, but it's still useful to be able to say, here's an identifier that you gave me that you know me as, and I'm going to send that instead of my public key. That's a really useful simplification and optimization. So GNAP does allow that. But instead of grafting these runtime keys onto a system that requires client identifiers, which is what dynamic registration and DPoP and MTLS and other things have to do, we invert it and say that this is a system that everything is by keys, but if you tell me an identifier, I'm going to use that identifier to look up a key that I've already seen using whatever system I want, and then I can figure out whether I trust you or not. And if you're just sending me a key, well, maybe I've seen that key before, maybe I haven't, and that's going to change how I see, how I process my policy at the AS. But it's a consistent system that allows for optimization in common cases. All right. This is a security workshop, so a bit about binding keys to the various messages. We all know that bearer secrets are problematic because what you have, what you send, and how you verify it are the same across the board. Proof of possession hopefully works in a different way. And with this crowd, I know I don't need to go into detail. In GNAP, key proofs are used everywhere. Every message that the client makes to the AS is going to be signed in some fashion. The starting request, any continuation request, anything. All of the access tokens you get are key bound by default. If you want a bearer token, you have to send a special flag to ask for a bearer token specifically. And then you get back something that is specifically a bearer token. This means that by default, all messages to the resource server are also signed by the client, and they also use the same message signing mechanisms. And GNAP is importantly very flexible about what those methods are. There's HTTP message signatures, there's mutual TLS, there's a couple of Jose-based methods, and there could and probably will be more ways for clients to be able to bind keys to the messages that they're sending to the AS and to the RS. For those of you that weren't here this morning, HTTP message signatures is a draft in the HTTP working group. It's a detached signature method mechanism for general HTTP requests. You can go to httpsig.org to play around with it if you like. Although I've just been told that apparently signing the status code on the response is causing something to crash. So don't check that checkbox, but try the other ones. And it's importantly designed to be profiled, and we've profiled it for use in GNAP. So the way that it works in GNAP is this is a request to the GNAP authorization server. We create a signature input string based on the parameters that are required to sign inside of GNAP, and then including the content digest right here, which is what protects the body. And then we attach that to the message, and we have a fully bound and protected message to the AS. Real quick to Yvonne, yes, we do have token exchange as part of ongoing grant requests and token rotation support. So yes, there are also advanced token exchange mechanisms that aren't specified in GNAP, but would probably be better fit for a more comprehensive extension. All right. So, oh yes, and then HTTP message signatures with the access token, because I said this is these same mechanisms get used for calling the RS as well. We have an authorization header. We sign the authorization header, including all of its content, with our request, and we're using the same mechanism to talk to the RS that we're talking to the AS, which makes the amount of code that the client needs to write to support all of these much, much smaller. All right. Now, on to the data model of what's being requested. Now, we've got a few different blocks of data, and they're dealing with, and they go in different directions. There's first the stuff that the client wants to access, so that's a set of APIs. Then there's a bunch of stuff that the client wants to know about the current user that the AS might know without calling an API. And then there's information that the client has about the user. So first, API access. In OAuth 1, you either got access or you didn't, and that was pretty much it. OAuth 2 had the innovation of scopes, which is a set of single string values that are separated by spaces. The data model, though, is that it is a set of values. In GNAP, we also have a set of values, but those values are themselves rich multidimensional objects. So if you've worked with RAR in the OAuth space, that sounds probably familiar. And there's good reason. The GNAP access request is backported to OAuth 2 as rich authorization requests. But in RAR, we have to deal with other parameters like scope and resource and audience and other stuff that affects the request because we have to live in that OAuth 2 space. In GNAP, we've got a single data model. We've got a single way to say that this is a list of stuff that you're requesting, no matter how it's represented. So this is what a more complex authorization request would look like. And we're asking for a couple of things here. First off, we've got the type field. And just as an example, I'm using the photo API. The actions that we're asking on this API are the read, write, and dolphin actions. And those are whatever that API decides them to mean, because this type controls everything else that goes inside the object. Again, if you are familiar with RAR, it is exactly the same model. The location say basically where you're doing it. So what you're doing, where you're doing, and what you're doing it to. So I want to be able to read metadata and read images and write metadata and dolphin images, whatever that means. It's the full cross product of what I'm looking for. And if I wanted to be able to say read images and write metadata and only those, then I provide two of these objects, one that says read and metadata, one that says write and images next to each other. I didn't write up that slide mostly because it takes up a lot of space. And down here, we have what's called a reference shortcut. I'll get more to that in just a minute. But it's a way to shortcut this whole thing for APIs that understand it. Now, the entire contents of that object are defined by whatever the type value is, and that's just a string that the AS recognizes. We've defined a set of common fields inside the core that I was just talking about, but implementations can define whatever they need. So if you've got user attributes that you're asking for, account data, network identifiers, if your schema doesn't fit into that, access locations, data types, identifier model that GNAP and RAR give you from the beginning, that's totally fine. That's actually fully expected. And that type extensibility is really, really important for allowing people to apply this security protocol to whatever kinds of APIs that they can think about. So I mentioned that there was that little reference shortcut down at the bottom, because sometimes you don't want to have to send that whole object. Maybe you've got a set of really, really common things that you want your developers to be able to do. Scopes are really great for that. So in GNAP, we've got basically the equivalent of scopes. So instead of sending in type photo with read metadata and write image data like this, I can send a string that just says metadata and update image. And the AS that's implementing this gets to decide that the update image maps to this object and metadata maps to this object. So the two requests are completely equivalent to each other. And I send them in the exact same part of the message. So I'm sending access with either objects or strings inside this list. All right. And this is something that we couldn't, unfortunately, do with RAR without kind of breaking the OAuth model. We couldn't co-opt the scope space to allow this type of optimization. All right, subject information. OpenID Connect showed us the value in being able to pass information about who's there right now at the same time that you're getting access to the APIs. So is the mapping advertised somewhere, Yvonne? Not as defined by GNAP, because that type of mapping is fairly complex and I would not expect it to be machine readable. I encourage anybody who wants it to have a machine readable version to propose an extension to do that. I've seen people try to do this with things like JSON LD and other systems, and I think that that's nightmare and madness lies down that road, but GNAP doesn't say you can't do that. All right. So OpenID Connect showed us the value of being able to talk about the current user. And information about the current user in GNAP is available as either assertions or identifiers, but GNAP doesn't define formats or contents for either of those. It just says, if you're doing assertions, these are the ones you can use, and you can extend that with a registry. If you're using identifiers, we're actually using something from the security events working group, the subject identifiers there. And all of this is completely separate from API access. Just like in OpenID Connect, I get the ID token, which is an assertion, alongside my access token, which allows me to call an API like the user info endpoint and other endpoints. Same exact pattern in GNAP. Again, we're trying to learn from everything that's been built on OAuth within the last decade. So GNAP allows you to say, when I get the information back from the server, says the subject identifiers for the current user are, and it gives me a list using this subject identifier format. This is just the opaque identifier format. There are a bunch of other ones, including email addresses and issuer subject pairs and other stuff that are defined by the security events draft. When the client is talking to the authorization server, it can also present this as a hint. Because sometimes the client has an idea who the user is. Maybe the user logged in previously and the client wants to make sure that it's the same user that's going forward. And it wants to be able to tell the AS, hey, here's who I think it is. So GNAP has spaces for the client to send that information, but then the AS gets to decide how much to trust it. So if the AS trusts that the client is sending correct information, maybe it's an opaque identifier that was issued only to that client, and the AS recognizes that it's the same client that it sent that specific opaque identifier to, then that's probably pretty trustworthy. If it's an assertion that was issued to a different client that expired 6 months ago, then I probably don't want to trust that one. But the AS gets to decide. Because if the client can send enough information about the current user, the AS can say basically, well, maybe the user doesn't actually need to interact. So sometimes we can skip that. And there are very real use cases out there today where people are bolting multiple OAuth grant types together to get exactly this kind of functionality. GNAP allows that all to be part of the same conversation, because the client would effectively say, here's who I think the user is, but if you need to talk to them yourself, here's the ways that I can start interaction. It's all built into, like, that whole structure is built into the protocol. Now, there's a lot of advanced stuff in GNAP that we don't have really time to go over. Somebody did ask, though, about multiple access tokens. I've got examples of that in a moment, so we'll get there. And grant management. But there's a lot of stuff that sort of starting at a new foundation allows us to do in ways that are not impossible with OAuth 2, but are very difficult to pull off with OAuth 2, especially in any type of consistent way. And so any possibility of notifications from the AS to the client. You know what, since we're on the advanced side, Mark, if you could actually jump on the mic, I'd like to hear more about that, please.
Well, one of the cases I've been thinking about is where the AS needs to perform a process that takes a period of time beyond a normal transaction, and then needs to, for, I guess, partially for optimization reasons, it's better to use a notification to return or to inform the client that something's changed.
Yeah, great question. So what we have right now to fit that is that I glossed over it before, but there's this interaction finish mode that what you basically do is the client says, whenever you're done processing your stuff, here's where you call me back. You make this HTTP request at this URL, and then that's going to tell me to go do the next step of the process. What's there is designed to support sort of longer term interaction, or the types of clients that can't take a request from a browser, but can take a request from a reasonable request from a web server, or act as a web server rather, but are not expected to be user interactive web pages. That type of thing is probably the best fit for it for what's there, but other types of this sort of interaction finish and signaling stuff could be defined also. I know in CIBA there's like the notification push method that I think could be really interesting here, and other kind of stuff. Good question though. All right. Since it was asked before, I'm going to go into multiple access tokens really quick. And then we've got a few questions in chat that I want to talk about. First off, this is what multiple access token request looks like. Previously, the access token was the access token request was a single object with access of what we were looking for. And instead, the client can send an array that says, this is the array of tokens that I'm asking for. The key difference here is that each item in the array now has to have a separate label for it. And this allows the client to decide, these are the tokens that I want. These are the kinds of tokens that I want. And this is what I want you to call the token when you issue it. And so the response is in parallel to that. The access token field comes back as an array, and you get the token value itself, and then you get the which is associated with the specific label, right? So the this is possible because of how we've been able to sort of redefine what the responses are from the authorization server. In OAuth 2, there's been a couple of proposals of multiple access tokens in the past, but we keep running into the fact that the OAuth token response is really about a single access token. It assumes a single access token, and there's not a lot we can do with that. So let me see what else here. Access shortcuts as well as subject agreed upon. So subject attributes don't need to be agreed upon necessarily off the wire. To Yvonne's question in the chat, but I think that that's really a topic for kind of a larger identity specific protocol. And so the real key here is that I think that ultimately we should have an OpenID Connect for GNAP type of thing, whereas OpenID Connect was able to take the delegation protocol part of OAuth and build a full-featured identity protocol on top of it. I think the same kind of thing can happen here. So grant updates. Dimitri, unfortunately, I don't think we really have time to get into it, but the basic idea is that the, let me get the response, the message response, sorry. There we go. Part of the response is that if the client is allowed to keep talking to the authorization server, it gets back this little bundle here, which basically says, use this access token to call this API at this URI. That API is defined by the GNAP core protocol. And it includes functions for continuing after an interaction. So when you get back that redirect in the front channel, or you get back the HTTP post in the back channel, you have something that you can send back to the server and continue the process, much the same way that you would send an authorization code today. But you can also send modified GNAP requests, just using this as an example, and say you need more access than what you had previously been granted. Well, you've got an ongoing grant that you're working on at this URL, so you can manage it by saying, like, you know what, I need this additional thing added onto that. And then the AS gets to decide, well, okay, that's fine. I don't need to talk to the user again because everything you're asking for, they've already approved. Or it can say, like, no, I'm not going to give you that. You need to go get the user involved. You know, tell me how to interact. Cleaning up that language in the spec is one of the things that's on the editor's plates in the very near future, because we realize that it's a little bit that it's not entirely clear how that's intended to work. But the idea is exactly this kind of thing, like you're given an API to manage your grant over time, and that is foundational to GNAP as a protocol. And I find it very interesting that we're seeing this exact type of API being defined in the OAuth world by the FAPI working group with the grant management API today. Let's see here. Does GNAP define any security mechanisms for protecting the dynamic registration endpoint? No, because there is no dynamic registration endpoint. Because this is designed as a conversational negotiation protocol from the beginning, there's no need to have a separate pre-flight pre-registration that's machine driven like we have in OAuth. You can actually send all of your registration data as part of that initial request, right? This is just the initial request. This isn't a separate endpoint. This is the client saying, I want to go get some stuff. Here's the stuff about me. So there's no need for dynamic registration anymore. And again, I find it interesting that in the OAuth space, we're finding this automatic registration, I think it's being called, where you're basically doing this same thing as part of a push authorization request inside the OAuth space, which gets extra weird because there's supposed to be a client ID everywhere. Let me see here. Thoughts on how to prevent GNAP from being bloated, like OAuth2 plus extensions plus profiles? Stian, that is a great question, and I don't know. The best thing we can do is try to get the extension points right, and that's something that OAuth2 did a much better job than OAuth1, and I'm hoping we can do an even better job in GNAP. I can't predict the future, though. Let's see, client request. So client requests the label. Sorry, I missed this during the multiple token discussion. Yes, the client requests the label it wants the AS to refer to the access token as. And that's just to allow the client to be able to separate those parts of the responses. Because you don't want the client to try to use the high-powered token for a low-powered response or vice versa. You want the client to be able to directly correlate, this is the thing I asked for, this is the thing I got in the response. We took the approach of using explicit labels because having clients try to do fuzzy matching based on data structures like this is a losing battle. We know it's a losing battle. In GNAP, would the AS be able to federate? Right. So great question. That actually goes exactly to this idea of the AS as a token factory. Yeah. If the input to the AS is a different access token, that just fits in the GNAP model. It would have to be defined as an extension. We had some bits in this in the core, but they weren't defined enough, and they weren't driven by solid enough use cases for us to be comfortable with keeping them in. But yeah, absolutely. And if you look at the resource server draft, there is a bit there about an explicit token exchange from the resource server's perspective. So this is a client gave me an access token, and now I need a different access token to go talk to the backend. There is an explicit way to do that kind of exchange by extending the GNAP request with that. Let's see. I don't see any hands up. How are we doing on time? Oh, I think we're just about at time. So I will happily take any other questions, but until then, I just want to follow up or just wrap up and say it's not done. The core is really pretty stable, but we're at the stage now where we're really trying to improve it. Key rotation is the next big sort of mechanical security kind of piece that needs to be addressed in the core. It's been on our backlog for quite a while. But a lot of this is that the mandatory to implement discussions, the security considerations, and just, figuring out how exactly we want to fit all of this stuff together. That's what we're working on right now. And then we will eventually be able to focus on the resource server draft, because it has been sitting a little bit unloved in the last 6 months or so. Everything that you've seen here has been really just the last 1 year of work. And a security protocol like this takes time to get right. I want to encourage all of you to please get on the GNAP mailing list, txauth@ietf.org. We present 1 to 2 interims between the IETF sessions, and then we have an actual meeting during the IETF, IETF week. Hopefully that will be in person in the spring. We'll see how that goes. And but yeah, thank you all very much for coming here and for inviting me here for this talk. And I think I have blathered on enough, and we are at time.